I've developed a sort of human-centered approach. I would rather inconvenience the majority than exclude the minority. It's fine if people don't share that ethos, but that decision means that I want to maximize compatibility for my packages. No matter what version of Node you're using, you can upgrade my packages to the latest and ship it.
Hello, welcome to the devtools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey, everyone. We're really excited to have Jordan Harband on with us. Jordan, you are a legend in the JavaScript ecosystem. So it's really great to have you here. You've done a lot, and I just want to highlight a few things. So you're on the TC39, which is incredibly cool. I'm really excited to talk about that. Are you still working with HeroDevs?
Yeah, I started in December.
Okay, great. Oh, fantastic. So you're working with HeroDevs, an organization that helps companies who depend on dependencies that are no longer supported, which is a very admirable goal. You're part of the OpenJS Foundation. You've done a ton of stuff, and I'm excited to dig into all of that. But before we dive any more, is there anything else you'd like our audience to know about yourself?
No, I'm happy to be here. I appreciate, everyone who uses my open source stuff or benefits from any of my contributions. And I hope that, I think the most impactful thing for open source maintainers remains getting your employer to contribute in some way, whether through sponsors or Tidelift or thanks.dev or something like that. So if you want to help folks, not just me, but anyone, please advocate for them to do that.
That's a great message. So I think there are a set of profile pictures on GitHub and NPM that I've seen everywhere, and yours is one of them. I've seen you on countless GitHub issues, whether it's steering committee things or a litany of ESLint issues. So how did you get to this place where you were maintaining and participating in so much open source in the community?
Yeah, let's see. So, my first open source pull request was to a jQuery infield labels plugin, I believe, in 2010. I was working, at a company that had a website, and they were using the plugin. They had a bug, and I was trying to fix it. Ironically, that's I've since learned that's a terrible user experience pattern. But from there, I just I think I really appreciated the ability to communicate directly with the authors of the software and report bugs, but also fix them. And then at some point, more than one maintainer basically, I would file enough issues or enough pull requests, and eventually they were like, "Here, you do it," and they would hand me the keys. And that was always very kind of imposter syndrome generating because I don't want to fuck up, I don't want to screw up, I don't want to break things for people, and so I came into it with that very, I think I still have that sort of aversion to, not to change exactly, because that has other connotations, but aversion to causing disruption. And, I just kind of eventually, I kept accumulating more packages from other people. I started making my own whenever I would see something that I needed to do that was needed to be solved in more than one place. I would try and extract it to a package so I could share the source of truth, and I could have one set of tests. And, if I needed to fix a bug, I only had to do it in one place instead of 58. And, there's that programmer's adage, which is something if you see only create an abstraction if you see something repeated 3 times. And that's better advice than telling people to do it at 2. But at some point, I think engineers develop enough intuition to figure out, even at 2, sometimes even at 1, when it's going to be useful somewhere else. And so I've just kind of done that. And NPM has this small modules philosophy that's kind of the same as the Unix philosophy of a thing should do one thing and it should do it well. And that really helps a lot, especially NPM is one of only 3 package management systems that I would describe as non-broken. The other being Cargo and Nix. Cargo was based on NPM heavily. And that's because they allow you to duplicate dependencies in the tree, meaning that you can have something that depends on version 1 of a library and version 2. Everything else, like Bundler and Maven and whatnot, they're just a flat tree of dependencies. So anytime you update anything, you often have to update a bunch of other things. And it, my lived experience, my trauma there is from those specific ecosystems is how hard updates were. because as soon as you update something, a bunch of other unrelated things break just because they happen to use the same common dependency. And so not only does that world encourage people, I think, to avoid dependencies, but it also limits how much kind of reusability you can get out of your code. And I found myself loving that aspect of NPM, and just kept going. And then, part of that was maintaining polyfill packages, ES5 shim and ES6 shim. And then eventually I started making polyfills that were single standalone packages. And that also is what led me into TC39.
That's awesome. So there's like two parts of that I want to dig into a little bit more. One is just like, so talking about like a large scale open source maintainer, like how do you keep on top of everything? I mean, GitHub notifications, love to the GitHub team, but they're kind of a nightmare. Like it's really hard when there's a lot of activity to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, they are, and it is. And V2 is in many ways better than V1, but like the team seemingly got defunded right after they launched V2 and didn't get to some of the improvements they talked about doing. But nonetheless, that is how I do it. I get email notifications, but I almost never use them. I just kind of mark them as read en masse every now and then. But I have the GitHub notifications tab open on like my tablet, my phone, my computer. That's the first thing I look at most days, the last thing I look at most days. And I group things by repository so that I'm able to quickly because there's some repos I follow where it's, I don't actually care most of the time, but I don't want to, there's every now and then there's a really important thing I don't want to miss. And so 90% of the time I can just like mark all as read and ignore that repo. And then there's some projects where it's like, if an issue pops up, I by highlighting it by project, I'm able to immediately say, oh, I need to prioritize that. That's a big deal. Versus if it's just in this big, long, undifferentiated list, that doesn't really work for me. So that's how I do it. And then I also have, Slack and IRC and Discord and email and all the things. And I think just my particular brand of, neurodivergence or whatever it lends itself well to lots of different ongoing threads. And, there's that thing that says that like, only 10% of people are good at multitasking, but everybody thinks they're in that 10%. And, I think I'm in that 10%, but who knows?
We'd like to thank Mux for sponsoring our podcast this week. Mux is a video platform for developers that enables teams to ship video-based products faster than ever before. If you're looking to add live streaming or stream on demand video content to your product, Mux has simple APIs that can enable you to ship that in days, not weeks. They have tooling built for every stage of the video pipeline, whether it's simplifying video uploads, intelligently determining the resolution of video playback for your users, providing editing features to programmatically generate social clips or add watermarks, allowing you to easily generate thumbnails from video assets, and even getting in-depth analytics on how users are engaging with your video content. There's guidance in their docs for integrating with major web frameworks. They have SDKs and most popular programming languages. They are a very extensive platform that will help you ship your video products faster. So if that sounds interesting to you, go check them out at mux.com. That's MUX.com. Yeah. One other question on the topic that you covered before. So we were talking about like the shape of NPM, how you feel like this is like one of the only sort of package registries that's not broken. And there are some people who feel very strongly that the incentives of NPM actually incentivize bad behavior. It's like, oh, we have too many dependencies. Oh, there's like too much like fragility and, risk involved and, potentially for like supply chain attacks and things. And left pad incident is like a very popular thing that people bring up. So I'm curious to hear about like your take on this sort of like alternative perspective on NPM and its shape.
Well, humans in general, myself included, we like to paint things with a broad brush, especially when we're going for rhetorical impact on it, whether it's on a GitHub comment or a Twitter thread or whatever. So it's often oversimplified in lots of different directions. And I am very guilty of that. That said, right, like, if you've done enough interviews for a programming job, you know that literally everything is about trade-offs. So, or if you've worked long enough in an org. So there are always trade-offs for any of these decisions, right? Like there are some things that are problems because of the NPM model of a graph versus, let's say, the bundler or Maven model of a graph. There are some problems that you get introduced as a result. It also fixes a lot of problems. The whole concept of peer dependencies, which is a thing that's very confusing and hard to explain. And, even though the few of us that think we understand it, that doesn't make it easiest for us to write docs that convey that understanding, right? But peer dependencies are a necessary solution to one of the problems that the NPM style, that a deep graph like that creates. The thing I would invite anybody to do is if they think something is particularly good or particularly bad, is kind of try and think about the first principles of like, what are all the variables here, right? And so left pad is actually a great example because it's not a good example in the sense that everyone used the left pad incident to say, well, look, see, this is why small modules are bad. But the same exact thing could have happened if like the ESLint maintainer or Babel maintainer or whatever had unpublished their package. Left pad was 100% and only about like the ability to unpublish, which NPM immediately, rectified more or less. Like they have there's like a very tight unpublished window. And while that needs refinement, right? Something that's well-known and dependent on, you can no longer unpublish. That problem is fixed. It'll never happen again. And I'm pretty sure that Cargo learned from that and made it never possible in the first place, right? So good, people learn from mistakes. That's a good thing. But when people talk about supply chain attacks, the number of dependencies doesn't actually have a bearing on that. Because if you're in the camp where you want to audit all code in your application, I mean, good luck to you. But also you have roughly the same amount of code, possibly more, with 0 dependencies than you do with 10,000, right? It's just about where that code is. And so that doesn't really help that problem. The main issue, so whenever people talk about the security of NPM, and this includes in expert rooms filled with experts like the OpenSSF discussions and people talking about SBOMs and provenance and all this stuff. The vast majority of the incidents, there's a lot of security issues that are theoretically problems. Oh, look, this package, if you installed it by accident, would steal your crypto or something. Sure. But people aren't doing that really. It's not installing things by accident that often. So of all of the list of incidents on NPM that had material impact, that were, or could have had much worse impact if they had been caught, right? That were a real concern. The vast majority of those are not things that can really be programmatically prevented. They're from a bad actor, either a good actor who turned rogue or a good actor who, was conned into handing over their package to, somebody who became a bad actor or wanted to, so the XZ incident, right? Which is not NPM, but, that was a 2-year long con that, it's hard to imagine that wasn't state sponsored, right? That you can't defend against that with software, right? And so one of the complaints that I get on some of my packages is, look how many dependencies there are, but they're not looking at the right number, because the number that matters is not how many packages, the number, just like it doesn't matter how many lines of code, right? We now know that is an absurd thing to care about. But people cared about that a lot 40, 50 years ago, so we've evolved since then. And similarly, I think we need to evolve past caring about package count and care instead about publisher count. How many humans could screw up my dependency graph? That's what matters. And if you have 10,000 people in your company and you have 100 maintainers in your graph, guess which code base is more secure? It's not your first party code, right? Because you have more people that could screw it up. Now you have more levers on those employees, right, to prevent that. But that it's a different way of thinking about it that I think folks kind of forget. It's because the numbers that are front and center are the ones that are easy to calculate. Issue count, tarball size, number of dependencies, right? But those aren't actually useful metrics to look at.
Yeah, I do find that interesting that you can't really one-to-one the amount of packages you have to authors, because really NPM's full of authors like you who are prolific and really take up sizable chunks of that graph.
Yeah. And when you compare two packages that do the same conceptual thing, right, there's more than just if you only use package size, you're going to end up with security issues in your application, because you're going to find somebody will make a package that's 1K smaller solely so they can take over your supply chain, right? That that's not the only metric you need to look about. It's not something you should ignore either. As a trade-off, right? Like one of the trade-offs of having a more secure package ecosystem, which I would argue NPM per capita, it like objectively is like the most secure. But one of the trade-offs is that yeah, you have a lot more internet bandwidth. You have a lot more tooling that you need to manage all the dependencies. You have potentially a lot more disk space that you need to use for your caches or for your installed graphs, right? But like I have hundreds of projects fully NPM installed on my machine, and like I think my all inside one directory, and that whole directory is like 20 some gigs, and that's not that much these days. That's like I think a $5 USB drive would cover that. So it's like people are complaining about disk space, but not really like thinking about it in realistic terms. And if you're trying to eliminate internet bandwidth, then sure, you can do that. Like, but arguably also that's NPM's job to worry about because they're the ones paying for that bandwidth. And you know, it's also not that simple, right? That doesn't mean that I or any other package author should just ignore concerns about, you know, disk space or bandwidth. But like they have to be weighed in concert with all of these other considerations. And then in terms of what I was saying in the beginning, right? Like this sort of fear of disruption that I have, the thing that causes the most problems isn't performance or space, or like in my experience, right? Isn't like this thing ran 10% slower. That sucks and you need to fix it. But that's not like a PagerDuty 4 a.m. kind of incident. That's just a regression. You need to fix that. You need to look into it and figure out why it's happening. But if something stops working on a browser that, you know, 10% of your paying customers use, that is a stop the world situation. That is a far more important consideration to me than performance or size. And that's informed by, you know, just my personal like, lived experience in, you know, I've worked at some smaller companies. I've worked at some bigger ones. Like I worked at Twitter and Airbnb and, you know, very large code bases, very large teams, and small ones. And these are all real problems, right? Like I think that it's just too easy to oversimplify and paint these things with your favorite brush, whatever that is, and then say, therefore, A is bad and B is good. And that's a fine conversation to be had when it's just a kind of didactic argument. But obviously, when it turns into people, you know, being jerks or harassing people or generating internet outrage, then that's perhaps not the most productive solution.
Yeah, for sure. And before we get to that part of the conversation, your opinions around legacy support, I do want to touch on your involvement in TC39. I find that a fascinating subject also, that like you're literally defining the future of the language and then almost at the same time alluding to the next part of the conversation. Some people kind of think you're holding it back. So there's this interesting dichotomy between those two things. So like you told us how you became involved. It was through your various low level packages, but what have you worked on while you've been at TC39? And like, do you have an area of specialization?
So I've worked on a lot of things. I've championed, I don't know, it's probably around a dozen proposals at this time, but I have to go count. And I don't really have an area of specialization. I certainly know a lot about like observability and APIs and like things like brand checking and robustness, right? Like I don't like to do in my packages, I don't like to do like dot push on an array, for example, because somebody could have redefined what dot push means. But so like I bring that sort of perspective of like, how can we make the APIs that are added to the language less susceptible to untrusted code monkeying with it. I think the thing I'm weakest on is like grammar and parsing and, you know, kind of syntax stuff, right? Like I have plenty of my opinions about usage of it, but I'm not very strong in my like understanding of the consequences of adding new syntax and so on, right? Like I was an editor of the spec for 3 years, so like I have a pretty good handle around spec language and how to describe something.
Of the things that you've been involved with the TC39, what like proposal or work that you've done are you most proud of?
Good question. The things that have already landed. So I think there's a bunch of stuff I'm happy is there, like object.values and entries was my proposal. I took it over from someone else, but nonetheless. And then so there's a lot of things like that that are useful. But I think that the one that I'm the most proud of so far that's landed is one that I actually designed myself, which was match all, string.prototype.match all. Because I kept occasionally running into this problem of like, I have a global regex that also has capturing groups and I want to get all of them. And so I made the proposal to address it. And that one seems to be there. I haven't heard any controversy or complaints about it. And I've gotten some, gratitude about it. And that one was 100% me. And so I'm pretty proud of that one.
I love both of those JavaScript features. I use them I use the former quite a lot. So your like main ethos with a lot of the package stuff is I don't want prototypes to be polluted. How does that extend to these TC39 proposals? So like in the case of match all, is it like you're worried that someone will overwrite match all to do different things? How do you prevent that from like a spec level?
Yeah, I mean, so there are plenty in the language itself. We have to follow precedent and be consistent as much as we can. And that means that often by necessity, we have to put in things that are observable from code, like things that end up being a hook point where you could like monkey patch something, or you could put a custom toString on some object and then like observe, like be able to run your own code at some point in the algorithm. So it's not always avoidable, but I'm aware of it. And I'm not the only one on the committee who tries to minimize those things, both because like engines can't optimize it as well because they have to they can't like do something different because the user code could depend on the exact order that those things happen. And then, folks that are concerned about some form of security, right? So like Salesforce, for example, runs like they allow you to write your own JavaScript plugins that then run in other people's websites. And like they want to be able to do that safely, which is a very big ask. And so they have a way of kind of locking down the JavaScript environment. And in order to do that, they need to know what things are locked down and what kind of invariants or like axioms that they want to maintain in the language in order to do that safely. So there's a lot of those different concerns. And that sort of Salesforce use case, they're not the only one. There's a blockchain company that runs like smart contracts in JavaScript using one of these lockdown environments. There's an embedded chip company that runs JavaScript like on small devices. And like in order to maximize what they can put in ROM instead of RAM, I believe that it's really important for them that things be non-observable. And so they have to lock things down. And, so there's a lot of actual use cases with lots of real money behind it that most web developers just have no concept of because they don't have to deal with it. And so it is easy for them to hear those constraints and not care. And in general, inside TC39, that happens a lot where some people have a constraint that most of the other people just don't care about. But like we have to, as a group, try to care by default just because other people in the room care and see if we can meet the constraints altogether. And sometimes that means things don't advance or they're stalled for a long time. But part of the danger of JavaScript in particular, which is that in another language, you could remove something later. In JavaScript, you never can. The number one rule is we do not break the web. So like pretty much anything that gets adoption on the web is there forever. And so it's most software choices, if you really screw up, there's a timeline after which your screw up is gone. And with JavaScript, there is no timeline. It is there forever.
Yep. There's always that one guy who misspelled refer, and now we all have to misspell it forevermore.
Forever. Yep, that's right. You got it.
Are there any other big, maybe like accidents or things that y'all wish would not have landed but that did and had like unconsequent or like unintended side effects?
Oh, there are many. So the language process for ES6 and earlier was different than it is for afterwards. So ES 2016 and later is a different process. In that process, although those things can still happen and they're much smaller and harder, like more rare. So I can list a number of things from ES6 that were designed sort of in isolation that turned out over time to not have been great. So for example, like regular expressions have a bunch of symbols, like 4 symbols, so that you can make a subclass of regex that doesn't use the built-in regex parsing engine. And in theory, that's a great capability to add. But in practice, that has created so much work for every browser and engine, and also drastically slowed down regular expression work and like made it really costly to make changes in certain parts of the language. And just on balance, I think even though the committee doesn't have an appetite to try and remove it because there's a chance it might break websites, like I think we all wouldn't want it, like wouldn't have added it if we knew, right, at this point. There's also some of the decisions made with class that kind of made it harder to add class fields later or decorators later or whatever it is. There's one thing called the override mistake that the folks who care about that kind of secure subset of the language are really upset about, which is basically if you freeze, let's say you freeze object.prototype, then you can't like, because it has like, let's say a toString on it, you can't assign toString on anything else or it'll throw. And so like what they would have preferred to happen is that it like, if it can't, if the thing is frozen, it like it makes a data property or I don't know, something like that. But there's like little edge case things like that have ended up affecting the language's consistency in a lot of different ways. And the committee has to balance pragmatism with idealism. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to get anything done.
Yeah, it's a unique constraint of the web that we can't really break anything ever. It's like it's probably astounding to any other platform. But I think that really is a nice transition into the next part of our discussion, where we discuss your opinions about legacy support. So recently, you became the main character on Twitter, let's say, for some of your opinions behind how packages should support older versions of Node. Somebody found that you support all the way back to 0.4, which is like almost the start, I think. So why do you think that supporting these older Node versions is so important?
Good question. So the particular incident you're referring to is flooded with misinformation and wildly inaccurate misunderstandings or inaccurate understandings. But setting that aside, so the first thing is I am a firm believer in semantic versioning. So the fastest way you can get a lot of people angry at you, even faster than I got people angry at me, is to make a breaking change in a non-major version. React and TypeScript have a modified version of Semver or a form of Semver and cause these issues in minor versions, and they get flack for it every time, despite years of saying, here, we don't actually follow Semver, we follow a version of it, right? So if you want to drop support for something as a package author, okay, right? Like with respect to Semver, go for it, but do it in a major version bump. That's all. So that's the first thing. And part of that, like in the NPM ecosystem, there's the extra wrinkle that the engine's declaration, if you don't have it, it defaults to star. That is in the docs. That's always been the case. And so if you haven't said explicitly what your Node version support range is for a package, you have to support everything. And if you want to if you want to make a more pragmatic argument, you have to support everything that worked and it was reasonably expected. And it was like reasonable for users to expect it to keep working. So when you did v200, if something worked and it was a reasonable use of the library, then in version 1.248 or 2.48 or whatever, like you can't suddenly break it. Even if you didn't actually want to support their environment or whatever, you have to do a v3 to drop that support, or you have to support it. So that's kind of the one angle of it. But the other thing is, and this is partially informed by my experience in ecosystems like Rails, where when you force somebody to do an upgrade by doing a major version, right? Because a major version, everything stops, right? You can't just seamlessly upgrade to it. You have to review the changelog. You might have to change things. You might not. You might have to make sure your environment is compatible. Maybe you already are. But it's a big deal. It's a high cost process to by publishing a major version bump, you have imposed a cost automatically on the ecosystem, and it's significant. The difficulty of updating bit is that the thing that in many of my past employers has held us back from upgrading the most by a large margin is these types of compatibility problems. Like in order for me to upgrade a Rails or Node or PHP, I have to make it so that move is as small and as possible so that the risk is as low as possible. And the more dependencies I have to change at the same time, the harder that is. And so it's a lot easier to do 100 pull requests updating 99 dependencies and a platform than it is to do one pull request updating them all at once. And I'm far more likely to get in trouble or like cause a production incident if I do the single PR versus the separate PRs. So I never want my packages, ideally, to be the reason that an upgrade is harder. I don't support Node 0.4 because I think people should be using old Node or old browsers, right? Part of my also argument is that it's easy to test on Node 0.4 and CI, and that gives me JavaScript environments that are similar to a lot of old browsers. So I can make sure that I'm not depending on features that, would break eventually in a web browser that I'm not otherwise testing for. So that's part of it, right? If I got a reliable automated in-browser testing solution to cover old browsers, I probably wouldn't support old Node anymore. I would just support browsers and new Node. That still might create the same constraints on my packages, but it would more clearly explain what I care about. And that's also because all of my experience looking at the internal private analytics of all of these employers is that the idea that everybody updates their browsers or that any browser is evergreen is just completely blatantly false. Tons and tons of people, like enough to make any developer cry, are stuck on old browsers. And the reason that they're upgrading is not the website still works. The reason they're not upgrading is that something else is hard. Either they don't have enough disk space, or they don't know how to do it, or they're on a locked down computer because they're in some computer lab and they can't make the changes, right? You breaking your website is not going to force them to upgrade. It is just going to hurt a human being. And when you think about things in terms of human beings affected instead of percentages, it becomes a lot harder to justify dropping support of stuff. And so I've long ago developed a sort of human-centered approach, which is that I would rather I would rather inconvenience the majority than exclude the minority. And it's fine if people don't share that preference, that ethos or whatever, but that decision means that I want to maximize compatibility for my packages. I want to make it easier. Like you can use, no matter what version of Node you're using, you can upgrade my packages to the latest and ship it. And then you don't have to deal with any of my code when you're actually upgrading Node. And that makes upgrading Node easier. That is the opposite of holding the ecosystem back, in my view.
Yeah, I can definitely resonate with the upgrading packages story. Like 10 out of 10 times, it is always a breaking change somewhere else that's holding me back. Like upgrading more than one dependency at a time is just fraught with terror. So the ability to only do it one at a time is pretty big.
And then the other angle is about vulnerabilities. Like lots of majors strand a bunch of users on old versions. So for example, there's a popular NPM author. He has a lot of packages. He makes breaking changes quickly, like frequently. The theory generally it's because or at least pre-ESM, the stated reason was that they want to just use new shiny syntax and they don't want to have to care about users of old things. So they just make a major, and to their credit, they always followed Semver and they did a major bump. But then when a vulnerability gets filed on one of their libraries, it's like version 2 through 5 is affected. And then they publish a fix on V5. All the users on versions 2, 3, and 4 are screwed. And then the maintainer has to do more work to do a backport, or they have to leave a bunch of users out in the cold, or those users have to do a bunch more work to upgrade, which is, for all the reasons we've discussed, might not even be possible. And then there's other reasons too, which I've only understood since coming to work at HeroDevs. There's companies that have they're government contractors or whatever, and they could have contractual legal requirements that they are not allowed to update their dependencies because of stability, but they still also are required to have no vulnerabilities. And so they're in an extra bind, and that's where HeroDevs business comes from. And so the creating a major version is a very high cost. And the other thing is you can go look at, there's a great website, majors.nullvoxpopuli.com. And you can type in an NPM package name and group it either by majors or also by minors. And it'll show you the last week's worth of downloads on that package. And I think people would be shocked if they looked at maybe not top level, direct dependencies like frameworks and Webpack and ESLint and Babel, like tools, right? Those are probably more healthy. But if you look at the graphs of a lot of transitive dependencies, I wouldn't describe them as healthy, because you see these like spikes in the older unmaintained versions. And in that case, what that means empirically is the ecosystem did not want the breaking change enough to upgrade to it. And the ecosystem here might be lots of people, but it also might be 10 people who are, who have popular packages that are like feeding the priming the downloads for that transitive dependency. But nonetheless, that's your consumer, right? And so if your consumer doesn't want to upgrade to you, you screwed up, and you can choose to not fix that, or you can choose to try and fix that. Or you can choose to avoid the problem entirely by not doing a breaking change. And that is usually what I opt for.
Yeah, I've definitely been in those package situations. In my eye, I've harped on it on this show a lot. ESM versus CJS was such a mistake on so many levels.
And that would be a whole other podcast. And it does I didn't mention it when you asked about TC39 mistakes, because it would be a whole other, podcast or 7. But it's the same with packages that go ESM only. What they have done is they have made a breaking change that makes it impossible for some users to use them. And you can go look at that website I mentioned and see how, like, the number of users that, like, there's somebody who's been making graphs of like how many popular packages have migrated to ESM. And if you look at those same numbers by where users are assigned to versions instead of where it's like I think the way they're doing it is all downloads are grouped by the latest version. But if you actually look at the specific version that is being downloaded, people aren't using native ESM yet. And the way to change that isn't to make everybody else's life harder in the meantime. There are ways to change that, but that's not it.
I'm curious to sort of like to build off of this conversation. So we've mentioned a few times you work at HeroDevs.
Mm-hmm.
And so this organization like is very explicitly for extending the life of open source projects. And could you talk a little bit more about like the details of like what that means and like what your day-to-day kind of looks like?
Yeah. So let's say Vue, for example. So Vue 3 is out, Vue 2 is unsupported. What this means is that there's a security vulnerability in Vue 2. You've got it. There's no fix for it available. And the Vue team is not going to fix it. So you are guaranteed to not get a fix for free. And your choice then is you can upgrade to Vue 3, which if you can, you should. You should use the migration guides, the change logs, like whatever's out there, and you should try and upgrade. Nobody's saying you shouldn't, right? But as I mentioned, there are a lot of organizations that can't. Either legally and contractually, they can't upgrade, or they just don't have the resources to do it right now, and they need to buy themselves some time. And so what we sell at HeroDevs is, we call it never-ending support, but it's essentially a private fork of the public package with security fixes included, so that you can install that and nothing breaks and your vulnerabilities are patched and you can achieve, PCI compliance, FedRAMP compliance, all the different checkboxes that people need to check. And then we donate some percentage of that back to the maintainers, and which helps them develop the new version. So, there's perhaps an argument that people could make that like we're enabling someone to use an older version. But while that's true, they're going to use it anyway. It's the same as the browser thing, right? Like nobody's using an old browser because they need an incentive to upgrade. Everyone wants to be on the latest and greatest all the time. If they're not, there's a reason. And you are unlikely to be that reason, whether you is the software author or the website or whatever. Like there's some other reason, and making life harder for them isn't going to make it easier for them to upgrade.
So as part of that Twitter drama, there has been a lot of movement and even like a community form. There's the E18E community they're trying to, it's called the ecosystem cleanup. They're just trying to go through and reduce bloat in the package ecosystem. And they've kind of identified you as bloat in the package ecosystem, which I find crazy. But what do you think of these like modern packages? Like I've seen Neo Traverse and people trying to re-implement everything in new stacks. What do you think of that?
Well, it's unfortunate that initiative was mired in some incredibly toxic behavior by a lot of the individuals still working in it for a month or more. But setting that aside, I think that that's the only thing that they should have done in the first place. If you don't like what an open source package is doing, use a different one. I think it seems like there's some folks out there that believe that by being part of a community of people using an open source package, that gives you any entitlement or right to decide what happens with that package. It doesn't. Open source is not like it's the MIT license is as is. There's some great blog posts about that. Like, if you don't like it, go somewhere else, right? Like, obviously the maintainer probably wants to hear your feedback and wants to make you like it. But if you've given that feedback in a friendly way and they aren't, amenable to it, then peace out, like do something else. And so if somebody wants to use, Neo Traverse or Neo QS instead of Traverse and QS, fine. But consider that that's adding at least one more maintainer to your graph, because I'm probably still in there. It's like, look at you should be looking at there's also the likelihood that those APIs remain the same, right? Like, in order to keep that up. So people ask, how can I do all the work to maintain all these packages? Well, the author of those two packages has now signed up to not just to maintain those two packages, but to follow very rigorously two of my packages. And every change I do, they need to figure out if they have to, most of them they're going to have to incorporate, and they can do that. That's their choice to do, and that's fine. It's just like, that's a lot of work to sign up for. But then the consumers now have to decide, and now I want to trust somebody who, you have to decide to trust a new publisher. And, I'm not at all implying that particular publisher or anyone else is less trustworthy or credible than I am, right? Like, that is a subjective determination everyone's got to make for themselves about each person. But it's something you have to figure out. And the amount of time in the ecosystem, how many people know them in person, their financial ties to things, their citizenship, all of those things actually really come into play if you're looking at it from a supply chain perspective and a reliability perspective. And I wish them luck. I have offered my help in a few places to try and help them do it correctly. I think the main fallacy is that people think that I'm benefiting in a way from like having lots of packages and downloads, such that I'm incentivized to, in a shady way, increase those numbers. And I dearly wish that was the case. Like, if that was the case, I would have lots of mansions and, like, sure, then you could make that accusation. But I still have to have a full-time job. I live in an expensive place. I have kids. Like, I have like payments to make. Like, open source just it's not lucrative, right? Like, and the number of people on the planet who have made a living just doing open source is very small. And like, in the JavaScript ecosystem, I can think of like 5. And one of those people got hired full-time by Vercel to do it. So it's like, it's just not a reasonable claim to make, because not enough people are paying, are donating their fair share or whatever, or contributing their fair share into that ecosystem. If they were, then that would become a reasonable conversation to have. I still would claim that is not influencing my decisions. I do these things on packages that have no downloads the same as I do them on packages that have millions. But it's also fun to see the people who have made those accusations trying to get their own packages adopted places and increase their download counts. But people can make of that what they will.
Yeah, it is another person in the stack, and it's like, I've found through my open source work that it is hard. You don't like, it's not something that everybody can stomach for like ever. And like, you've been in the ecosystem for like, you said 2010, that's 14 years deep into open source. Like, maintaining that much stuff is an incredible amount of work. And I don't think that these people are really understanding that fact.
I mean, I agree, but I think another angle is the things the industry, like the zeitgeist, cares about change over time, and things repeat. There's like cycles, and this is a period of time where it seems like a lot of people are caring about size and performance. And great, those things should always be improved if they can be. But I think I formed a lot of my opinions during a time when size and when pursuing size and performance caused way more problems than it solved. And so I don't value that myself very highly. That's not to say if someone can keep all of my same constraints and make my stuff faster and smaller, 100%, I will take that. It's just that in order to make things faster, smaller, they have to drop constraints. And that's been brought up too, right? Is that like, if you make a tiny replacement library, not like the Neo things are different, right? That's trying to like match it one-to-one, just written differently. But like, if you're just trying to say, well, instead of using A, you should use B, they do kind of the same thing, but like B is smaller and faster. Almost without a doubt, that's because B has no features compared to A. And anybody who's using any of those features can't use B. And if they think they can and they switch to B, they'll break something and you've just caused them way more pain than you've saved them. Right? Like, I think that's the other thing is like CPU time is more expensive than disk space, and human time is way more expensive than all of those put together. And that's there's trade-offs, right? Like you can talk about environmental impact too, but it's all about relative impact as well.
Yeah, I think we'd sort of started off by talking about this before we started recording, but the important thing here is like to remember that we all have things that are important to us. There are a bunch of trade-offs that we have to make, like you've been saying, and like it's easy to get like dug in on positions and get really heated, but like we're all just trying to make good software here and like help people out, and especially in the open source community, because it's such a thankless job already, and it's like it's rough to see people like in that community sort of turn on each other. So just
for sure.
Prefacing all this is like, at the end of the day, we all, have things that we're trying to do, and we just want to make the ecosystem better.
I would also add the Chesterton's fence, I believe is the term, which is before you take down a fence, you need to understand why it's there. And I think that and again, I've suffered from this just as much as anyone else, that there's a lot of folks that are relatively new to the industry or young or both, and they can have amazing ideas, and the age is not a requirement at all in any direction for skill or for innovation or whatever. But it is often correlated with experience, and experience can help you answer why something is there and how important it should be. And I think it's often underappreciated. I think people look at something that's been that's like, oh, that thing is 10 years old or, whatever. And it's like, well, there's a reason and you don't have to agree with it. Before you complain about it, you should try and understand what the reason is. And if it's a bad reason, maybe you'll convince the person to change it, right? Like I can be convinced differently on any of my opinions. It's just, you'd have to present a good enough argument.
Something I wanted to talk about related to some of your earlier work and like your current work, talking about, extending legacy support for packages that are no longer actively maintained and trying to make sure that they have security updates. I'm curious about how you feel about automated CVEs, because it's been a thing. Like in GitHub, you get like a lot of automated notifications. It's like, hey, there's a prototype pollution issue with this package, or something like that. How do you feel about like kind of where the ecosystem is at with that, and like how valuable those are? And maybe I would follow up that with one other question is like, what do you think a valuable signal is for like learning about vulnerabilities that need to be patched or dealt with in your organization?
That's a good question. Okay. CVEs are better than nothing, and they're also terrible. One of the main reasons they're terrible is they don't have a clean, structured way of talking about code paths or code branches. So like for many of my packages, they only do one thing. So if it says you're vulnerable, you probably are. But like I have some packages that have 10 different options. And if you're only vulnerable when using one option, and that affects 1,000 people, versus it actually affects 1,000 people instead of the like 2 million or something that are using the package, then only 1,000 people should get a CVE notification because the others don't have to care. But there's no way to prevent that. They'll all get the notification. I think that's a big piece. The other thing is there's not a facility in the CVE ecosystem to indicate that a vulnerability doesn't apply transitively. So like, for example, I maintain an ESLint plugin, and it has some transitive dependency or direct dependency that's vulnerable to something. But the way I'm using it, it's not vulnerable, period. Right? Like, it doesn't apply. There's no way for me to check a box somewhere that says, I'm the maintainer of this ESLint plugin. I guarantee that nobody is vulnerable from this CVE based on using my ESLint plugin. They might be vulnerable some other way, and then they should still be notified, but not through me. But instead, I get all these issues with people complaining, well, oh, my security scanner said there's a problem, you need to fix it. And my answer is no, I don't. I'm depending on this with a carrot range. Like, I can't do anything just like you can't. We all have to wait for that person to update. And when they update, you won't, I won't have to. Or my answer is, well, I can't upgrade to the new version because of these various reasons. So I'm stuck with this one. So either they can backport a fix, please go ask them, or it's a false positive and you can just ignore it. But, seems like there's a lot of organizations where engineers aren't empowered to ignore those kinds of warnings or override them. And those people end up getting screwed, and that sucks. So like, I think that when you're talking about direct dependencies, it's your move to make. When you're talking in an application where you have a lock file, it's your move to make. You can update things, and the only things that you should be creating noise anywhere about beyond that are things that that you can't fix by updating, and ideally all of the noise would direct you to the only place that can, which is the author of that transitive dependency. And in the case where that's me, great. Like, then I deserve that noise. I need to fix the problem, and I need to release an update. And then, as soon as I've done that, it's on everyone else. And, usually it's the people with the lock files who are able to do the upgrade. They just don't know that that's what they have to do.
So when it's your issue, you do a practice that not many other people do in the NPM ecosystem, where you like actively maintain each release line. So in those cases, are you picking it to those release lines? And then also, do you have any tools that like help you do that? Because it seems like a lot of work.
Yeah. So most of my packages avoid breaking changes, so they're still on V1, so I don't have to deal with it. There's a smaller subset of packages that have a few majors, and so usually I try to at least backport it to the majors, and I'll check that website I mentioned, like, to see if they're still being used, right? Because if no one's using them, who cares, right? I'll wait till I'm asked. But the only tool that I've found I need is, and I made a package for it forever ago. It's called Safe Publish Latest. And when you try to publish a package, if the version number you're publishing is earlier than the latest version, it will stop the publish and say, whoa, are you sure? Because when I've done backports, sometimes I've accidentally marked V1 as latest when V2 should be latest. And that can break a lot of systems too. And that's a feature I want NPM to add and to obviate my package. But until they do, that's the tool I use. Other than that, it's just Git. I check out the version tag that I'm branching off of, and I cherry pick the commit in and modify it as needed and push it up. And then once CI passes, I publish it.
So as we're wrapping up, we always like to ask our guests about something in the future-facing question. And for you, and especially given sort of the topics that we've covered, what do you think about what do you think the future of like maybe NPM, or more generally, what is the future of package management in JavaScript? Like, what does that look like?
Okay. I would love to see GitHub start funding things that don't have the letters AI in them again, so that NPM can get the funding it needs. Like, NPM should have like 100 full-time people on it, and I doubt it has more than 10. If that's fixed, then I imagine that the future is just continual improvements to the CLI and continued iteration of like best practices for how to publish packages. And it just, things will continue getting better gradually as they have been. It was a very different world 10 years ago. As if that doesn't happen, then I think it would be incumbent on the potential competitors to NPM, Volt.sh, and they would have to make a product that interoperates with NPM well enough and provides enough benefit and value to incentivize people to migrate. That is a very tough challenge, and I hope that in the event that GitHub does not fund NPM properly again, I would hope that one of them is able to achieve it for the betterment of all of us. Yeah.
I'm excited to see what happens with those other ones, and I wholeheartedly agree with NPM. Like, even the UI is kind of busted sometimes now. It's definitely kind of gaining some bit rot.
Yeah, I mean, every time, all the work the NPM team has done now and over the years, I think is great, right? Like, they do good work. It's just there's nowhere near enough of them for many years now to do all the good work that's required. So this is not a slight to any of them. It's only a slight to whoever is deciding the budget for that department.
Well, that wraps it up for our questions this week. Thanks for coming on, Jordan. This was a great conversation around an area in the Node ecosystem that doesn't get too much light. So I'm glad you're there holding it up.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for the conversation. And I appreciate your perspective and the sort of wisdom and guidance of having worked in this space for a long time and taking in a lot of considerations for people who, quite honestly, probably don't get a lot of representation. So appreciate that.